Mandatory minicamp kicks off for the Chiefs on Tuesday. Today, I'm taking a look at who I think could possibly make the roster on today's Locked On Chiefs.
From the land of the free and the home of the Chiefs, this is the Locked On Chiefs podcast.
Hey, Chiefs Kingdom, welcome back for another episode of Locked On Chiefs, your daily podcast covering the Kansas City Chiefs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for always making Locked On Chiefs your first listen of the day. Don't forget, we're free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube. I'm your host, Chris Clark from Chiefs Corner. Lots of different things that we could talk about over on Chiefs Corner, whether it's the draft, getting into the salary cap, getting into some stats, and maybe some advanced stats later this season. But today, I want to talk about the Chiefs roster, who I think is going to make this roster and who is possibly going to maybe make some surprises. And maybe there's going to be a couple of cuts that will be surprises. That's what we're going to be looking at. A little bit later, we're going to talk about the special teams, how that's going to play into who's going to make the roster on both offense and defense. Next segment, we'll talk about the defense. I do want to start off with the offense and get started talking about who is going to make the roster on this team for the Chiefs. But before that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right. So let's take a look at this offense and let's run this down. I know this is very premature. They will be having, like I said, minicamp that kicks off on Tuesday. So maybe by the time you're listening to this, you will be seeing that they have already started mandatory minicamp. It will run Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday this week. But we're going to talk about who I think is going to make the roster and what we've seen so far when it comes to OTAs and a little bit more. There is plenty to talk about, so let's just dive in right now. Quarterback, let's just get the two out of the way. I only think they're going to keep two. I am projecting potentially 25 for offense, 25 for defense, and 3 for special teams. So just a heads up on that. But quarterback is pretty easy. I don't think they keep 3 on the roster. I think that they only keep 2. I think that they have Alodakun be their practice squad guys. So I think you're going to see Wentz and Mahomes be your 2 quarterbacks that they're going to keep on this roster. Running back is a little bit different than what I would have expected before we got here, right after the draft even. I don't think that I would have gone this direction. But right now, from everything we've heard, and this is one of those things, obviously Isaiah Pacheco is going to be on this team. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to be on this team. And right now, as it stands, it sounds like Louis Rees-Zammit is going to be on this team as possibly the starting kick returner. That is going to be fascinating to watch. I was not expecting him to make the NFL roster this year. I was expecting that they were going to keep him on the practice squad and make sure that they were able to try to get him ready to go for 2025. But it does sound like he has made such an impact at that position. He's shown that he is able to play the NFL game. Now, when the pads come on and he starts taking some hits, we'll see how that changes, how he changes his pads level and how he changes how he runs. But right now, he's really impressing coaches, and it does sound like he is expected to be their starting kick returner, which would put him on this roster. So that gets us 3 running backs. I do think that they brought in a guy like Carson Steele to potentially come in and be the 4th running back / fullback. Ryan will be very happy about that. So I do have them keeping 4 fullbacks this year, or 4 running backs this year, including Carson Steele at this point. And just so you know, I think we'll do this again right before training camp. Probably a little bit through training camp. We'll take a quick gander at what we think the 53 is looking like, maybe after the first week and a half or so in camp. And then you'll get our final predictions right before the season starts and right before final cuts. So when we keep going, we start looking at the wide receiver. Well, let's start with tight ends, actually. Kelsey, Wiley, Gray. And I do think they keep 4 again this year. I think that they're going to go with Irv Smith Jr. And part of the reason that I think that they're going to keep 4 tight ends is because I do think that they want to keep and go 3 tight ends on a regular basis. And when you look at the guys that they have on this roster, having an extra tight end on the roster gives them the ability to have an extra one just in case something happens. So I do think that they keep 4 tight ends this year. If we go on to the wide receivers, this is where it's going to get intriguing. And I'm really going to be curious to see how things shake out when we get to camp. Not quite there yet. Obviously, you figure that Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy are all on the team. I don't think there's any question on that right now. I think those three guys are set. I would say probably 90% that Justin Watson is on the team. We'll see whether or not that continues to translate when we get into training camp. McCole Hardman, I think, has a pretty good chance of making this roster. But as the fifth wide receiver, I think that they would be pretty happy with that. If you look at the contract he just signed, it was reported at, I believe, $1.25 million. So that's league minimum for somebody with his experience. So I think that it's possible he makes this roster as wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 6. And here's where it gets interesting. I think they only keep 6 wide receivers. So I think that right now, Kadarius Toney is going to be one of those guys. Whether or not that changes in training camp or preseason games, we'll see. But I do think that it's possible that you're looking at guys like Sky Moore, Justin Ross, Nico Remigio, all being gone off this roster this year because I just don't see them keeping 7 wide receivers again. Could be wrong. Maybe they keep 7 wide receivers and they don't keep a fullback, or maybe they don't keep an extra tight end. We'll see. But right now, I'm going with 6 wide receivers. Now, let's get into the offensive line. Right now, Suamataia and Wanya Morris are pretty much guaranteed to be on this roster. Joe Cheney would be guaranteed, Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, and Jawan Taylor. I apologize. Then you're starting to look at the backups, and this is where it could get interesting. Hunter Norzad, I believe, is on this team. He's a draft pick. CJ Hansen, I believe, is going to be on this team. The question that is going to become, who is going to be that last guy? Is it going to be a guy like Mike Caliendo? Is it going to be a guy like Lucas Niang? That would give them 4 tackles. Or could it be somebody like Ethan Driscoll? Or maybe even Goddard Chu from the international team. Right now, I have it as Ethan Driscoll being that 9th offensive lineman. And this would round out the Chiefs offense and get them 25 players in total. I think that they are probably going to be in a situation where they're only going to be able to keep 6 wide receivers, and I would expect 9 offensive linemen, although we'll see. Maybe they go 10 and they drop a tight end or they drop a running back. But I do think that they're going to stick to only 2 quarterbacks. It's also possible they keep more offensive linemen and they drop somebody from the defense and go shorter there. They've done that several times before as well. So lots of different ways that this could go. I'm going to be very curious to see which way they go, but that's who I have making the roster so far at this point. And when we get back, we're going to dive into the defense and let's talk about who I think is going to make the roster for this team as it sits right now. Summer means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. Whether or not you want to go bet on the Royals versus the Yankees, which kicks off tomorrow night, or you want to go bet on the future NBA Finals games, there's still going to be a couple more of those to go, whether you want to bet on the Mavericks or the Celtics. Lots of different things you can bet on at FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet everything from the NBA Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Is it going to be Bobby Witt Jr.? We'll see. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on TV all day? Do you have to ever turn down the volume with all that shouting? Go make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so we looked at the offense already. Let's take a look at the defense. This one's a little bit tricky as well because you start looking at how this is going to play out. We can look at what the Chiefs have done in the past, but I would still expect the Chiefs to stay around 25 guys. Sometimes in the past, they've gone down to 24 on defense. I'm not so sure that they're going to be able to do that this year, and a lot of that has to play into the DB room, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But if we're looking at this, and let's start up front, George Karlaftis, Chris Jones, Derek Nottie, and Mike Danny are probably going to be your starting 4 when the season kicks off. Then you're going to have Tershawn Wharton, Felix Anudike-Uzomah. I'm expecting Fabian Lovett to make this roster, Farrell as another defensive tackle combo, and Cam Jones. Now, there's a couple guys that aren't on this roster as of right now. Charles Omenihu is not going to be on the roster more than likely. I would imagine he's going to be somebody that they're going to activate during the season. We'll see if I'm right on that or not. But the other one, and we just don't know anything right now, is BJ Thompson. And after his scare last week, and football is the last thing that we need to worry about when it comes to him. But that's the big question right now is he going to be a guy that could possibly come back and actually be on this roster? He made it last year, so you would think that if he's able to play, that would be something. But that's the big question. Is he going to be available to be on this roster? And again, football is the last thing we need to worry about when it comes to Thompson. So prayers up to him. Hopefully he's able to get healthier, and he is working back towards being able to just be a healthy human being before we even worry about the football aspect of it. But right now, obviously, I don't have him on the roster just because it's so up in the air and we don't know what's going on right now. So something to watch there. When we flip it over and we go to the linebacker group, this one's a little bit different than it was last year. Obviously, Willie Gay's not here, so that's going to be a change. But Nick Bolton, Drew Tranquill, and Leo Chanel are going to be your starters. Don't think that there's anything that's going to really change that. The question is when you start getting into the linebackers and the backups. And right now, I have a couple of new backups. I take that back. Cam Jones actually made the roster last year, so he's not going to be a new one. But I do think he's going to be back on this roster this year. The new one is going to be Curtis Jacobs, and I do think that he is going to replace either Jack Cochran or Cole Christensen, both of them actually on this roster. I think that he's going to be a guy that is going to step in and earn a job as a rookie, and that's going to be something that Kansas City is going to be able to find another undrafted free agent rookie like they did in Jacobs, and he will probably make this roster. That's at least what I'm picking right now. We'll see if that ends up turning out to be the case. Obviously, a long time before we get to cut down day, but that's where I would go when you start looking at the defensive line and the linebackers. And when we start getting to the back end of the defense, this is where it's going to get intriguing. I kept 9 defensive linemen. I'm keeping 5 linebackers. That means 14. So if they stay with 25, that would mean that they would have 11 DBs, which makes a lot of sense with all the depth they have at that position. And it's going to be curious to see how Kansas City does that this year, if they keep 11 or if they keep 10, and what is their breakdown between corner and safety. So let's just get into it. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, obviously. Trent McDuffie is your number one corner. He's going to be your starter, whether it's inside or out. He will be on the field. I would also think that either Josh Williams or Jalen Watson are going to be another starter. We'll see if that continues to be the case when we get into training camp. I think both those guys are still on the roster regardless. But the big question is, it sounds like Nazeeh Johnson is now back in playing in teams. And he is available for the 11-on-11, and he's in doing the team drills. That means that he is getting close to being fully cleared, and maybe he is going to be fully cleared and ready to go once you get into training camp in July. He tore his ACL back in training camp last year, I believe, in early August. So it would make sense he's going to be about a year removed from that. But I do think that everything we've heard about him so far is it looks like he is looking just about as spry as he did last year. And if that's truly the case, he could be challenging for one of those starting roles at corner, which is going to be a good deal because obviously L'Jarius Sneed is no longer in Kansas City. So at that point, having him back as a guy that can step in and start, I think that would be a huge boon for the Chiefs. Now, the question is, where do you go from there? Lots of different guys that could end up being on this roster. I do think Nick Jones is going to be on this roster. They drafted him last year. I don't think that they're going to get rid of him after a year. So he is my 5th corner at this point. And right now, I have a little bit of a surprise for who the 6th. And I'm glad I rechecked my notes. I had Kelvin Joseph making this roster, and I think that he could make this roster. Maybe it's in place of Nick Jones. But Kamal Hadden is going to be on this roster, I would imagine. He just got drafted this year, so I do think that Kansas City is going to keep him. I do think they keep 6 corners, even though I don't think that most of them will be playing throughout the season. Kelvin Joseph is a guy that has really stepped his game up and is looking like he fits on this defense. and fits into this scheme. So we'll see if that continues through training camp. Maybe he pushes somebody else off the roster. That would be surprising. He was a former second-round pick. It never seemed to work out in Dallas. And so we'll see whether or not he is able to step up and do something that's a little bit different. But Kamal Hadden will be on this roster, and it's going to be interesting to see if he's ahead of Nick Jones, behind Nick Jones, who's going to get the game day designation to be on the field. We'll talk about that a lot more once we get closer to the season. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because generally speaking, you would think that they would only keep 4 safeties. I do think that there's a scenario where they possibly keep 5, and in my scenario, they're keeping 5 at this point. Obviously, Justin Reed's going to be on this team. There's no doubt in my mind on that. Brian Cook is going to be on this team. He's fully back from his injury, it sounds like, so I think that that's a good sign. And then you're going to be looking at Shamari Connor and Jaden Hicks will also be on this roster. But then you start getting down into it, and the question is are they going to keep a 5th safety? I do have them keeping a 5th safety in Deion Bush. Bush stepped in and was able to get an interception in the playoffs last year. He showed that he is able to step in and play on the defense in a very limited role if he's asked to. I think that's huge for this roster. And when you have so many young guys, Shamari Connor is going into his second year, Jaden Hicks into his first season, and you have Cook as almost an elder statesman at the position, being here 3 years. Obviously, Justin Reed is the most experienced DB that they have, and that's something that is going to play in. Now, the other interesting thing is when you start talking about Justin Reed, is it also possible that his role expands from being a starting safety to maybe being the guy that is doing the kickoffs? Because when you look at what is going to happen on the kickoffs this year, there are going to be some big changes, and it's a question of whether or not the Chiefs want Harrison Butker out there trying to tackle a guy, because you're looking at a situation where they've done studies, and I believe they said something like 10 to 25%, somewhere in that range, depending on the team. The kicker was the guy that was making a tackle or trying to make a tackle with the new kickoff rules, because this has been done in the UFL. So that's the question. Do you really want Butker out there, or are you going to let a guy like Justin Reed step in and do kickoffs? It's not going to change his role as a safety, but it does give them somebody that can do some middle of the field stuff. It'd be back there to tackle. So that could be something to be a lot of fun and see how that plays out later this season. And when we get back, we're going to talk about the special teams specifically. I know we kind of already talked about Justin Reed, but we're going to get more into the kickers, the punters, and the snapper. But there's also some other special teams positions that could really play into who makes this roster. And when we get back right from this. As a golfer for years, I've been hearing PXG say nobody makes golf clubs like they do, period. And you know what? They're right. I went in for a fitting and I saw for myself. I went in and I swung the PXG Black Ops driver. It is a total game changer, and you no longer have to sacrifice distance for forgiveness. One of the things I absolutely loved about this experience was getting to go in and work with somebody one-on-one to work and make sure that the club was set up for my swing and the way that I play golf. I went in, started with a 7-iron, and basically warmed up with a couple of swings, got an idea as to how things were going to go, and then I had a PXG driver that was set up just for me. Took a couple of swings with that, made some adjustments, had different things that were changed on it, from loft to weight in the club, shaft. All of that really was changed. Even the grip got changed, and I was able to experience all that in a one-on-one setting with a PXG expert. The world-class team of PXG experts will analyze every aspect of your swing with every club and give you feedback in real time on how to improve. And if you're thinking that PXG's high-performance equipment is too expensive, their clubs often cost less than the so-called leading brands. PXG made me a believer. They'll do the same for every golfer in Kansas City. Visit pxg.com/lockedonchiefs to schedule your fitting at PXG Kansas City, 7517 West 119th Street in Overland Park. Get fitted for any club and you'll get a dozen golf balls free. That's pxg.com/lockedonchiefs to schedule your fitting. pxg.com/lockedonchiefs. Limit 1 dozen golf balls per person. Promotion ends June 30th. Other terms and conditions may apply. See your store for details. On Locked On Sports Today. they've got you covered, whether it is talking about the NBA Finals, the NHL Finals. All of that is going to be covered on Locked On Sports Today, the 24/7 YouTube streaming channel. Go check it out. So when we get to the special teams units, there's lots of different players that are going to play into. There's going to be lots of different things that are going to play into the players that are going to make this roster. Special teams is one of them for all the guys that aren't going to be starters. And this is where it gets interesting. Obviously, we know Harrison Butker is going to be on this team. James Winchester is going to be on this team. And as of right now, I'm going to go ahead and give it to Matt Ariza. Now, we'll see whether or not that changes, because the big thing is Ariza has the leg. He is a fantastic punter. He can handle, punting for distance and all of that. The question is can he become a holder? Because the Kansas City Chiefs do not have a holder. Tommy Townsend was their holder last year. So that's going to be a question whether or not he can be the holder this season on field goals and extra points. That's something that's probably going to also take into account from Harrison Butker, who he feels comfortable with is his holder. So right now I have it being Ariza. It could end up being Reckow. We'll see how that plays out. He has experience holding. Ariza does not. So that's going to be something that he's got to work on to be able to make this roster and make this team this season. Where it gets really interesting and where you start wondering about who's going to make the roster, it's going to be the question of who's going to be able to be on the special teams units. I already talked about Lewis Rees-Zammit, who I didn't expect to make the roster earlier this season, but it sounds like he has stepped in and he has shown, obviously, that he can play as a running back. They think that he can step in and be helpful there. But it also shows he's also shown that he can be successful and use his skill set and his speed on kickoff returns. And they do think that that's going to make him potentially the lead kickoff return guy. That could land him a spot on this roster. And as of right now, I have him on the roster because of that. The other one that I think could be on the roster because of kickoff returns is Mecole Hardman. He has returned for the Chiefs in the past. It would not surprise me for him to be on the kickoff return team with Lewis Rees-Zammit. So we'll see whether or not that plays out or not. But I do have Hardman making this roster. I think it's a little bit more that because he is somebody that they're comfortable with, a wide receiver. But I do think obviously special teams is going to play into it if he is their fifth or sixth guy. So he could make the team based on his special teams role. You start looking at punt returner. That's going to be a big question. Who's going to be that guy for Kansas City right now? I don't know. Kadarius Toney has not been at OTAs. It's possible that they could be using him as their main punt returner this year. That would be something that would not surprise me. They do think that he is an extremely talented wide receiver, so I still think he's on this roster. But it's going to be a question of how else does he fit on this roster, because right now I don't think he's one of the top four wide receivers, at least who is going to be on the field on a regular basis once Rashee Rice comes back. And that's going to be something to watch. It's going to be curious to see what they do with Rashee Rice. As of right now, obviously I had him on the roster. Whether or not that changes is going to be subject to if the NFL is able to get through their investigation before the season starts. It's possible maybe Rashee Rice isn't on this roster to start because he's suspended. And then you have another guy that makes the roster, as in maybe a Nico Remigio or a Sky Moore or Justin Ross. I mean, there's lots of different receivers that could make this roster if Rashee Rice is suspended for the first couple of games like we expect, but unfortunately don't know how that's going to play out at this point. So when you start looking at the rest of the roster, then you get into, okay, you have an idea of where you're going to go for your returners. Who's going to be covering kicks? Well, that's mainly going to be your CBs, your DBs, and probably your linebackers for the most part. So I expect that those guys are going to make the roster in part because of their special teams play. Maybe a guy like Curtis Jacobs makes the roster because they feel like he is going to be somebody that can be a core special teamer. And maybe it's, you're looking at some different DBs in Haddon and in Nick Jones. Or obviously Deion Bush is somebody that was always playing special teams and was a core special teams unit guy for this team in the past. It's possible he would continue to be that guy for the foreseeable future. We'll see. But there's lots of different pieces that are going to go into how this roster is going to come about and how this team is going to come together. And with OTAs over, obviously the next step is mandatory minicamp, which kicks off on Tuesday. And we will be covering that in great detail over the next couple of days. So be sure to check that out. But at this point, this is who I have for the roster. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed somebody or if you think somebody else is going to make the roster that I didn't say and who you think is going to not make the roster that I do have on the team. Let me know in the comments. That's going to be it for us today. Thank you all for listening. We will be back tomorrow to discuss the mandatory minicamp, and we will have that covered the rest of the week. Matt Derrick will be joining us later this week as well. Ryan will be back, and we will be covering all that's coming up. Thank you for listening today, and we will talk to you tomorrow.